Hello and welcome everybody to today's video and to my weekend in review for the French Grand Prix, and get ready for a little bit of a contrarian opinion as we're about to go out on a limb and say that that wasn't a boring race. I know a lot of people thought that one wasn't too exciting, but I'm going to tell you why it wasn't too bad in my opinion, and give a couple of reasons for it and go over some of the main talking points from the weekend that was in France. So once again, it was a very dominant weekend for the Mercedes team, just way out front, not really much challenging them. Charles Leclerc did a great job to claw back some of that space at the end. He was fighting after that VSC to try to pull back the gap, and he did make one final lunge on Bottas going into that final corner on the last lap, but maybe if he had another lap or two he could have caught him, but just wasn't able to get the job done when it came to crunch time. Another great drive from Verstappen. It's been a good year, great year for him so far, really showing the maturity that he has now and really showing the improvements that he's made in the last year. Sebastian Vettel managed to recover to 5 from 7. That wasn't the best for him. I know that his qualifying was goofed a little bit, didn't have the runs that he wanted to have. I think he was having some upshift problems, maybe some engine issues, so wasn't really able to get the pace in the qualifying and just wasn't able to make back enough of it in the race. The first of the McLarens classified Carlos Sainz in 6th. They were running 6th and 7th, but with that hydraulic failure to Lando Norris, even though he did a great job fighting through it, he just was not able to hold the rest of the cars off, partially due to a pretty crazy move from Ricciardo, but we'll get onto that later. So we got Kimi Räikkönen in 7th for the Alfa Romeo. That's a great finish for them. Not the same luck for his teammate Giovinazzi, who started a lot higher and finished a lot lower, which is a little bit disappointing. That strategy with the soft tires at the start really did not work. Similar problem for Pierre Gasly there. So Nico Hülkenberg gets that 8th place. It was going to be a double points finish for those Renaults, but again, we'll get on to Ricciardo shenanigans in a minute. Lando Norris, like we said, eventually classified P9. Great drive from him. Gasly gets moved up into the points because of Ricciardo's penalty, but very little consolation for Gasly there. Just a terrible weekend. Was nowhere to be seen. Again, was on the wrong strategy at the start of the race, but that was because he couldn't get the pace in the car in qualifying to be able to go comfortably through on those medium compound tires. So really just nowhere for him, and not where Red Bull wants to be. Back down in 10th, 11th place is not where they belong. And I think that they're going to start getting frustrated with him if he doesn't pick his game up a little bit. I know I just made a video about him and before this weekend, and he goes out and delivers a stinker like that. So it's definitely something that weighs on my opinion a little bit. I think that by now he should be starting to get the hang of the car. Like I said in an earlier video, I think that by Britain there should be something in place to get him either out of that car or to have him confirm that he's good enough. He needs to put something in. He needs to have a great weekend in Austria, his team's home Grand Prix, or else it's going to be a little bit of splaining for him to do, and it could be a lost race seat. So Daniel Ricciardo down in 11th after his 2 5-second penalties were applied. We'll just get to that at the end. No use filling it up here now. Sergio Perez and Lance Stroll 12th and 13th. A really poor weekend for Racing Point. They knew that that car wasn't going to be suited to the track, and like I said in my weekend preview, I didn't think they'd be overly strong. Both their cars retired in last year's Grand Prix, which it's not really the same team anymore at Racing Point that it was at Force India. Still a lot of the same staff, but a different overall team. But they didn't have the information from last year from that track, and the previous runnings at that track had all been in the 90s, so the team just didn't have any information on it really, and the car isn't well suited for it, so not a good weekend for them there. Danny Kvyat and Alexander Albon come next in the Toro Rossos in 14th and 15th. Not as strong as they've been in some of the other races, but again, probably a track that just did not suit them. Giovinazzi, disappointing weekend for him, finally makes it into Q3, but is just going backwards the whole time in the race, and I think once again that strategy not very good. Haas had a terrible weekend. another car that wasn't really well suited to the track. And Gunther Steiner actually said after the race that it was the worst weekend for Haas in their existence, which is insane to say. That's, I think, 3 years of existence right there, and this is the worst weekend that they've had, so no fun for them. Kubica in 18th finishes ahead of Russell, and Russell comes home in the final finishing spot. Russell had a bit of wing damage, had to do a second stop, so he was compromised a little bit, but him and Kubica had a great battle through the race, and were really showing that despite where the car is at this point, they're still both decent drivers, and they can both put on a show when they're around other cars. I still stand by the fact I don't think Kubica's been nearly good enough, but he did have a pretty solid showing this weekend, finishing ahead of his teammate. So we'll move on to the penalties there now. Ricciardo getting off the track a little bit when he was passing Grosjean, coming back on. Grosjean complains like he always does about somebody overtaking him. That one I don't really think should have been a penalty. It wasn't in the end, just because they weren't fighting each other. There was no places or time or anything to be gained there. Just basically a car that was out in the middle of nowhere being overtaken by a car that was destined to finish in the top 10. So nothing really in it there, but the move on the last lap I think was a little bit silly, especially from a very experienced Ricciardo. That's not an experienced move that he pulled right there. He didn't have to make the lunge there, especially considering he had Raikkonen and Hülkenberg right on his tail. Making a mistake into that corner like he did costs him both places, and he has to end up going off the track again to get Raikkonen back. I think if he had left it to Le Bossé, or like one of the more technical turns in that final sector, I think he could have made the move a lot easier, and then used Norris to put between him and the cars behind him as sort of a blocker. And whether Raikkonen or Hülkenberg were able to catch and pass Norris, it would have been irrelevant, because Ricciardo would have had that place. He wouldn't have needed to care about it. So I think it was a little bit premature. Not the best move from a guy who's generally known as a great overtaker in Ricciardo. Not really something that you want to be doing. It's the last lap. He risked it, and I don't think that he needed to. So he goes off the track, rejoins the track unsafely, pushes Norris wide, gets a 5-second penalty for that. In that little scrum, Raikkonen and Hülkenberg get past. So Ricciardo has to go to the outside of the track, leave the track completely to overtake Raikkonen, so he gets another 5-second penalty for that one, giving him 10 seconds net loss on the weekend, and dropping him from what was a 7th place finish all the way down out of the points to 11th. So very disappointing for Renault in their home race, very disappointed for Ricciardo, and I'm sure he's disappointed in himself a little bit. He had some pretty rude words to say after the race about the other drivers and his thoughts on the penalties, so he definitely wasn't happy with it after the race, but I think upon reflection, and once he gets a chance to watch it a couple times, he's probably going to accept that he didn't need to make that move there. It wasn't the best spot to pass, and he ended up making 2 pretty major mistakes that cost him and the team valuable points. On to the subject of the race being incredibly boring. I didn't find that. And part of my problem, and I don't want to sound pompous here, and I'll probably do a video on this in the future because it does bother me a little bit, is the culture around the crash, I'll say, and people tending to say if there's a big accident that it was a good race. If there was somebody in the wall, it's a good race, whether it's a safety car or not. I understand that people want to see the race spiced up a little bit, and a safety car is a way to do that. But honestly, I don't think that the be-all, end-all of a race is how many people put their lives in danger, how many people risk their lives in those cars on the weekend. While there is an inherent risk, I don't look at crashes and see that as good racing. To me, exciting racing is wheel-to-wheel, hard racing, and talented driving. And that start in France, I thought that there was going to be 3 cars out on the start. In my preview video, there were none, and it was close. That was talent right there. All 20 drivers down the field did an excellent job to keep out of the melee. Yeah, Perez had the 5-second penalty because he left the track and took to the runoff area, gained an advantage on the cars in front of him, but that was evasive action, totally warranted for what was going on in front of him, but nobody crashed. Nobody ran into each other. There was no safety car. And watching them rip through there, all 20 cars going as fast as they were, it's incredible to watch. That's just great racing. And I thought because the Mercedes got out in front, the directors at Sky finally decided that we're going to show some of the little scraps going on through the field. And I thought that there were a lot of really good scraps going on. There were a lot of really interesting little battles. They didn't show the Kubica-Russell one, but that one was going on. There was Stroll and his pit stop strategy, and then through the middle of the race you sort of had the Hülkenberg, Raikkonen, Ricciardo shuffle going on, who's going to pit when, the strategy going on there. So I thought, like, while there wasn't any crashes, no safety cars, no big rainstorm to throw a spanner into the works for the teams, I thought that it kept it compelling from start to finish. Off the bat, it was an exciting start. The cars kind of fell into place a little bit, but even then, you had Vettel out of place who was gaining on other cars. You had the McLarens. Are they going to keep that qualifying position or fall back a little bit? And then in the middle, you sort of had these conflicting pit stop strategies all coming together at the same time, and the overcuts and the undercuts. And even while that was going on, there were battles up and down the midfield. And then towards the end of the race, everything's bunching up again. All of a sudden, Leclerc is catching Bottas. All of a sudden, Norris has his car issue, and he did an incredible job to try to drive that car despite the problems that he was going through. And you had the Ricciardo incident. I thought, man, that was, from start to finish, that was good racing, and it was exciting racing. And I saw one comment from a viewer online who said that a boring race to everybody is when all 20 drivers drive perfectly and incredibly well and don't crash into each other. And like, to me, that seems to be true. I grew up around the track. I grew up with racing drivers. They were my heroes. And the last thing I wanted was for one of them to get hurt. And the weekends that we had where somebody passed away were the absolute worst weekends that you could imagine. The whole paddock was just sunken. From what is a 3-day, 4-day celebration at the track, a 3-day, 4-day party, if you will, to everybody all of a sudden just somber and down, and the pack-ups were always terrible. There was one weekend where they had to close the whole track because of a fatality in a Formula race, and it was devastating. I don't want to see drivers hurt. I don't want to see drivers crash. I accept that there's an inherent risk involved, but I also don't want to see them push those limits. I don't want to see them push those risks to the edge. Last year, when the Halo arguably saved Leclerc's life, that's an impressive accident, but not an accident I want to see. That wing easily could have got under the Halo and struck him up under the chin, maybe. I'm not looking for drivers to get hurt. I'm not looking for drivers to be put in deadly situations. That's why I have such a big problem with Grosjean, is because he doesn't just crash, he puts other drivers in situations where they could be hurt or they could be killed. And for that, he's not only a liability to himself, but to those around him, and I don't like that. So I'll wrap that up there before I go on for too long and get too passionate about it. Like I said, I'll probably do a video on that maybe sometime this week before the Austrian Grand Prix, somewhere in between my preview for that. But yeah, just because there's no crash doesn't mean it's a boring race all of a sudden. I don't agree with that. I don't prescribe to that thinking. I thought that it was an exciting race, duels up and down the field, conflicting strategies, and great driving. So my last point, one of the last things I want to touch on, Lando Norris deserves a massive round of applause. That was a level of maturity that's rare to see in someone of his age. Not only to be told that you're having these problems with the car, but to put your head down and just fight for it. And every lap, every turn, he was fighting that car and actually holding on to his place quite well up until the VSC. That kind of allowed the cars behind him to get a little bit closer, and eventually a couple of them were able to overtake him, partially obviously because of the Ricciardo incident. I already liked him, but he just increased his rep with me 100-fold. What a drive, what an effort, what a mature way to handle things. It can be really easy in that car, especially when you've had such a great qualifying and such an amazing race up until that point, when you hear that, to become disheartened and frustrated and angry. And I'm sure deep down he was, but he didn't let it show, and he kept the pace in the car. He kept pushing, and he really, really did an amazing job. And I didn't think he was a future star of the sport. I knew he had the talent, but if he keeps performing like that, you're looking at a future star in the sport, absolutely 100%. And maybe a saving grace for McLaren at this point, who have been a team that needs a light at the end of the tunnel, that had a few dark years. And I'm really rooting for him after that one. What a gutsy drive and what a gutsy effort. So thank you all for joining me for today. That's going to be where I leave it. I'll be back posting videos for Austria probably later in the week. And like I said, maybe a video about my thoughts on accidents and the excitement around races involving them. Then hopefully some F1 2019 content coming pretty soon. As soon as we get the game here in North America, it's a little bit delayed compared to our British compatriots there. So just waiting on the game, and eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to throw up some content for that. So thank you all for joining me for today. I hope you all have a great day. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much, and goodbye.